Trade will be totally in chaos for the weeks and months to come. Donald Trump, to some extent, is not very good at listening to policy advice. That would be a very dangerous route. That would go from a cold war to a hot war, so to speak. That would be very bad for global supply chains, not just for the US, for everybody. We have to protect ourselves and we have to protect our American investors in the European Union in order to move forward again.
Let's talk about this now with Jörg Wuttke, partner at DGA Group. Jörg, thank you very much for joining us. We'll dig into the trade downsides in a second. But first, has the US just done China a massive favour? Washington pushing the rest of the world's traders and investors into Beijing's arms?
No, I mean, the US doesn't do anybody a favor. I mean, the tariffs are so high that basically ships are getting turned around. And we talk about exports from China into the US of 500 billion US dollars. The container flows, 5 containers going into the US, only 1 from the US going to China. Now, it will have global ramifications because these 5 containers have to go somewhere. And of course, that might end up going into the global south and Europe. And of course, von der Leyen was calling up the prime minister. She's worried about this. So trade will be totally in chaos for the weeks and months to come.
OK, well, touching on containers, you gave a shipping metaphor when you spoke to Die Welt in the interview that you gave them there, saying that China will not give in despite these tariffs and that ship has sailed. So are we watching the early rounds of a full-blown economic Cold War?
Yes, we're at the cusp of it, really. It's around the corner. Actually, we're in the midst of it already in many ways. There seems to be a complete lack of trust and backdoor communications going on. And I just worry about the next stage. You know, you cannot add another 100%. It doesn't make sense already. Now trade came to a standstill, more or less, between the US and China. What is next is going to be interesting, meaning is it going to get into intellectual property? Is it going to be threatening for US companies in China? What is China going to do next? I hope there will be some cool minds in Beijing.
And some analysts believe that this trade war could shave 1%, 1.5% off China's GDP at a time when growth there was already falling. It was slowing down. One of our viewers, Sanka Dines, left a comment in our last video and wants to know how serious is a slashing of exports to the US for the Chinese economy?
Well, it's less important than it was maybe in 2017 when Trump unleashed the first round of tariffs, because exports might be important for China, but at the same time, it's a huge domestic economy. Of course, it will hit areas such as Shanghai and Jiangsu, Yangtze Delta, the Pearl Delta River. But what is more important really is what it does to other countries, because China is suffering from massive overcapacities. And again, the outflow will be tremendous, be it in electronics, be it in whatever product. And of course, Trump was deliberately putting taxes on Vietnam, Cambodia, meaning the backyard of China, where companies have been investing in order to circumvent the ban on Chinese products. So we will be seeing a complete rearrangement of trade, and this will take quite a while and will definitely lead to price increases. Inflation is around the corner.
OK, so we talked about the US, we talked about China, and you mentioned global trade there. We're expecting like a significant drop in growth for both of the world's 2 biggest economies if this continues, if Trump doesn't switch things back again. So what are the consequences for the global economy?
Well, certainly not good. I mean, inflation in the US will possibly in fall trigger a rate hike. That will mean that the US might go into a recession. And if the biggest economy in the world goes into a recession, then, of course, the rest of the world is having a big problem. You see already global stock markets tanking. You see a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty will certainly lead companies to defer investment. They will wait and see what's going on. So overall, you can blame one man, one building to trigger this kind of situation with lots of uncertainty. And clearly, we have to see how his own country is going to respond to this. Will they basically now call the White House? Will the red states sort of fall into one line and say, you know, stop of that, take it back? Still, there is a bit of time. But again, I don't hear these phone calls.
All right, but we've talked a lot about tariffs in the last few weeks and days here on DW, but there's a lot of ways for China to strike back against the US that goes beyond just pure tariffs. And US Treasury Secretary Bessent is worried that China isn't doing enough to punish people exporting fentanyl precursors. I mean, is that seriously a risk that China could unleash fentanyl on the US as retribution?
No, I mean, China has made a major effort in order to stop the fentanyl exports from China into Mexico, Canada, United States. And they made a major proposal. Xi Jinping wrote a long letter to President Trump about that. I don't see that China will basically start exporting this actively. But what I worry about is that they will stop acting against these fentanyl exports, hence that this product will still enter the United States or enter other parts of the world. So in a way, Chinese efforts have not been rewarded, and they might reconsider how to deal with that.
Okay, he also mentioned that the option of removing Chinese companies listed in the US from exchanges is still on the table. What would be the impact of that? How important is the United States major exchanges as a source of financing for Chinese companies?
Not really. China has been, sure, some companies have been listed. What is more interesting to watch is that China has been a major buyer of treasury bonds, and that might go down. They might actually move into other markets, as difficult as it is. But certainly the uncertainty in the global markets will be significant. China had some companies considering to make an IPO at Wall Street. That might be put on hold for some companies. So in a way, the uncertainty is just staggering, and it's not good for all of us. But again, it can be undone. Trump has a history of flip-flopping. I hope that there are some sober minds in the White House seeing what's coming, inflation, stagflation. We don't need that.
Yeah, we saw that China tried to discourage its companies from listing in the US after the whole debacle over Ant Financial and Jack Ma. Now, our viewer Nolan485 wants to ask about chips. So the US has the ambition of building cutting-edge computer chips at home rather than importing them from Taiwan. But China has 90% of the world's rare earth production, the raw materials needed to make the chips. How significant is China's leverage over the US ambitions to dominate advanced tech like AI and automation?
That would be a very dangerous route. That would go from a Cold War to a hot war, so to speak. That would be very bad for global supply chains, not just for the US, for everybody. I think that China actually will threaten that. It will possibly ask for licenses, will mastermind this in a careful manner. China doesn't have an interest in order to also derail globalization as it is. China wants to be perceived as a stable, predictable partner. And if they go down this road, this would undo it. So I don't think that it's going to be fulfilling this kind of worry that many people have, is that China will withhold rare earths from the global market. They don't want this.
Okay, you've said that Europe should stand by America because European investments in the US far outweigh those in China. I imagine that that capacity is not unlimited, of course, in terms of how much the EU can stay in its relationship with America. But still, Europe has billions tied up in China, and America becoming less reliable at the same time. Isn't Brussels caught up in a loyalty crisis here?
But if you look into the stock of investment that Europe or European Union, as a matter of fact, has in the United States, we talk about $2.4 trillion US. The stock of European companies in mainland China it looks like a measly 185 billion. So it's not even 10% of that. So the two economies, Europe and USA, are far more embedded and interlinked than Europe and China is. We always ask for more openness, more market access. We can't do the M&As in China that we can do in the United States. China is not a substitute for the United States, certainly not. But I hope that the governments in Beijing and Brussels will find a way how to control a possible overcapacity tsunami coming into Europe, that it will not trigger trade barriers. We want Chinese investment in Europe, and we don't want these containers overloading our economy. So in a way, it's all about communication and trust between Brussels and Beijing.
Well, I'll talk about those kind of imports overloading Europe in just a second. But just to stay on this point, I mean, you're absolutely right that the EU has far more invested in the US than in China. But still, critical industries for countries like Germany, with Volkswagen getting most of its growth in China for the past several years. That is obviously on the slide. But even BASF, the chemical giant from Germany, has invested quite a lot in China. What is the risk of China saying to European firms that are working there, you're either with us or you're against us?
No, I don't think so. They want European companies there as innovation drivers, as customers, as suppliers. I see actually the red carpet out. I was just in Shanghai 2 weeks ago, and clearly there was a lot of kind of a charm offensive going on towards European companies. And again, how long is that going to last? Of course, depends also what kind of policy actions are taken now upcoming months. But overall, China has an interest of having these high-tech investments. It will be difficult for those companies. Europe is top heavy in China, meaning the big companies are extremely successful there. We have 70% of European top investment in China is done by German companies. So Germany is first and foremost, of course, in the line. But so far, I can only see from Beijing, it's a charm offensive.
So would you say that this isn't really the wake-up call for reshoring for European companies? It's just the cost of doing global business now?
Well, reshoring in a way happens indirectly because the Chinese customers are buying less and less German machineries and cars and chemicals. These companies are trying to be in China for China, so they turn into Chinese companies with the German, French, or Italian brand. There is no way to get off the market. If China stands for 50% of global chemical market, that's where you have to be. And if it's 1/3 of the global car market, and in particular market where you can unlearn how to build cars and try to learn how to build mobile phones on wheels, you have to be there. What I always call the fitness center China. So in a way, the biggest risk is to leave China in many ways. But of course, that doesn't really apply to many of these small and medium-sized companies that really get threatened by price wars, by licenses and so forth. So in a way, hang in there and learn how to build cheaper and better cars, or chemistry. Retracting doesn't help you.
Okay, I want to come back to what you were just saying earlier, so that Chinese goods once destined for the US could come to Europe instead. That's actually part of a longer story. So it's been a sore point, Europe accusing China of dumping steel and solar panels on European markets. So do you think then that there is a risk that the EU will have products dumped here by China, and even that the EU may be tempted to react by imposing tariffs on China in turn?
Of course. I mean, they have to protect their industrial supply chain and the industrial base. Everybody does that. I mean, just look at Russia. I mean, the big friend and ally of Beijing, they had imported 1 million Chinese cars last year. And then the market share of China went above 70%. Russian brands were basically below 20 or 30%. And Russia has installed a recycling fee, which is a trade barrier, of course. And the imports from China into the Russian market went from 165,000 a month to 15,000 a month. So it's not just Europe that is acting. It's Turkey, it's Brazil, it's Thailand. Everybody has to watch out. So it should be in Beijing's interest, in order to channel these exports, in order not to trigger these kind of trade barriers. If the tsunami is going to happen, if everything presses into one particular market, in our case Europe, of course the authorities have to respond, and they have to respond fast.
Okay, for many years you've represented the European Chamber of Commerce in China, and the US has now reacted to the EU, so maybe you can give some sort of insights on this, basically saying no to its 0 for 0 tariff proposal. Has Europe lost its leverage, and is it time to play hardball?
Well, I think they play it pretty cool. Today we will see the response on the aluminum and steel tariffs that Trump has erected on European steel and aluminum. We have to see how far that goes. Europe is in a mode in order to reach out to the administration, but there seems to be no one really willing to listen. The famous deal maker actually has nothing to propose as a deal. And that's the big problem. That's the problem the Chinese have and the Europeans have, is that there is no communication, no dialogue going on. And how do we get out of of that. So at one stage, of course, Europe has to see that they come up with actions that actually doesn't hurt also Europe. Again, American companies are deeply embedded and invested in the European economies. They have a staggering more than $3 trillion invested there. So we have to see that we get the message across. You can't do this to us. We have to protect ourselves, and we have to protect our American investors in the European Union in order to move forward. Again, the man in the White House still has the say, and he can undo things that he has done over the last days. I wonder if he's going to do this, but it would be high time to do it now.
Okay, Jörg, I wanted to put an idea to you that I've had. I mean, wouldn't it be great if there was some sort of trade organization for the world, a kind of world trade organization that could step in here and do something about all of this?
Well, unfortunately, we have a very good organization, WTO in Geneva, actually doing exactly that. And the effectiveness has been eroded partly due to the fact that the US doesn't believe in that organization anymore. It needed to reform, but it needs nations in order to have the willingness to reform that. Europe always had, China actually also. But in a way, if the biggest player doesn't play ball, then it's very hard for this organization to be effective. I hope it survives this onslaught.
Okay, well, the WTO is essentially toothless at the very moment that it should act. This is its reason for existence. Whether it's the WTO's fault or not is kind of sadly irrelevant. Do you think that in its current iteration it should be scrapped, or can it be repaired? Especially with what you said in mind, that some of the biggest players are just ignoring it.
Yeah, I think scrapping an organization that has been maybe ineffectual to some extent, but has been quite valuable for a long time, would not be a good idea. Again, reforming it, we have to see how maybe the big nations sit together, realizing that US has left the table in order to reform it. I don't know how that can be achieved, but again, it's still better than the law of the jungle.
Okay, finally, Jörg, thank you so much for your time today. I just wanted to ask you one more thing. Can you give us any reason for optimism, some light at the end of the tunnel to finish on?
The only optimism I would have is that the red states, meaning the Republican-governed states here in the United States, the constituencies talk to their representatives, the senators, the governors, actually realize what damage it does to their own backyard. We might see the effect in summer when we have recess over here, people go home to their constituencies, then all of a sudden you might see demonstrations. We have people like Ted Cruz already speaking up. That's the only hope that I have. Donald Trump, to some extent, is not very good at listening to policy advice, but he might actually be more able to listen to his backyard. After all, next year we have midterm elections, and that's the last wake-up call that we have. So I hope that in late summer, fall, that people will find the way in order to address their representatives, and they might trigger a change in policy over here.
Okay, so maybe just a glimmer of hope there. Jörg Wuttke, thank you so much for your analysis today.
Thank you.